Just first, a quick word of thanks to Michael and to the whole crew who have been constantly here working, guiding us various places, making sure we get to our meals. They've done a wonderful job of making this, I'm sure you all agree, a smooth and satisfying experience. So maybe we'll have a chance to raise a glass in their honor this evening at dinner. They certainly deserve it. So, plunging in, modern physics presents us with some intriguing puzzles about God's relation to the causal structures of nature. The way theologians think about the causal structures of nature and about God's relation to nature is, of course, shaped by what we think we know about how the world is put together. And quantum theory provides a vivid instance of a physical theory that simultaneously deepens and disrupts our account of nature. It confronts us with the limits of our ability to provide imaginatively satisfying models for fundamental physical structures. Talk about God has always been an exercise in the art of thinking about a subject matter that we know from the outset, we theologians know from the outset, must exceed our comprehension. But it's really a striking feature of contemporary physics that it too leads us to the boundaries of what we can conceive. The theologians, I think, can hear a familiar note in the title of the collected papers of J.S. Bell, Speakable and Unspeakable in Quantum Mechanics. So that's why the first heading on that outline says Speakable and Unspeakable in Quantum Mechanics and in Theology. Perhaps there's a kinship between theology's ancient wrestling with the unutterable and physics' modern encounter with the unspeakable, since both are trying to advance understanding at the outer limits of what can be thought. So in this paper, I want to explore some theological questions that arise in this doubly difficult terrain of theology and quantum mechanics. This is a foolhardy thing for me to do. I am not a philosopher of science or quantum mechanics or a mathematician. I'm a philosophical theologian. So I hope that the physicists here will provide correction and guidance. What I'm trying to do is identify some difficulties that arise for classical ways of thinking about God's relation to the world when we bring those forms of thought into contact with contemporary conceptualities in quantum mechanics. So my main goal here is simply to identify those difficulties. I don't intend to try to resolve them. In some ways, I'm elaborating some of the themes that Bill Steger talked about this morning and setting up some of the problems that Michael began to address in his lecture yesterday. The overarching question here that I want to talk about is how are we to conceive of God's relation to the causal structures of nature? So the place to begin with that question is at the beginning, and that is with the doctrine of creation. So I will run past you again some of the themes that Bill had mentioned. The doctrine of creation has been developed in a number of different ways during its long history, and there continue to be important disagreements about this doctrine. I don't want to obscure that fact. I'm going to focus here on what I take to be the majority report in theology. Namely, that the act of creation does not consist merely in making an ordered cosmos out of primordial chaos, and it doesn't depend upon any pre-existing or unformed matter. Rather, the idea is that God is the absolute ground of finite things. God's creative act accounts for the very being of the creature, and apart from that act, there would be nothing other than God. That is the definitive claim in the doctrine of creatio ex nihilo, creation out of nothing. Nothing, of course, is not a peculiar sort of something, a resistant negativity that God must overcome and against which God forms a coherent world. That view, which some theologians have been tempted by, would constrain the divine creativity. And the point of the creatio ex nihilo doctrine is that God's creative act is limited by nothing outside God's own nature. Further, this understanding of creation affirms that God does not require or need the creature. God is God quite without created things. The act of calling the world into being is an intentional divine action, a divine initiative, that God undertakes for the sake of the creature, because it is good for the creature to be. And that stands in contrast to accounts of creation as a necessary expression of the divine nature, as, for example, in Neoplatonism. It also stands in contrast to most forms of process theism, and there probably aren't many people here in the room who are aware of process theology, but it has a considerable presence in American theology anyway. And process theists, by and large, say that God and world together constitute a metaphysically fundamental structure of creative becoming. So process theologies typically hold that God is not the ultimate ground or source of the world process, but rather God plays a uniquely inclusive role in influencing the direction of the world's unfolding history. The classical theological view, the one that I'm going to work with here, in contrast to that, understands creation as an asymmetric relation in which God freely calls the world into existence and sustains it at every moment. God's creative act establishes a universal, immediate, and continuous relation of ontological dependence of creatures upon the Creator. So when I started, I said we want to begin at the beginning with the idea of creation, but what I've said since should make it clear that this concept of creation is not, after all, tied to claims about the beginning of things. An eternal universe is just as much God's creation as a world with a datable beginning. And if our cosmological theories should lead us to conclude that the universe arises, say, from a spontaneous fluctuation in a quantum vacuum, then this too depends upon God. So when Hawking and company announced that quantum cosmology shows that there's no need for a God to get the world started, right? Their physics has put God out of a job. They simply misunderstand the theological doctrine of creation. It's a pretty simple mistake, but it's one they make repeatedly, as George pointed out yesterday, and it does help to sell their books. It's good on a dust jacket. So, this foundational divine action does not show itself in the world. It's not something that you would observe. The sciences are not going to pick up the traces of the divine creative activity. It shows itself rather in the existence of the world. Okay? That's because it doesn't merely bring about particular changes in the properties or relations of created things, which is what the sciences can think about. Okay? Instead, it brings about the creatures themselves. So there's a distinction here between causing change and causing being, which is noted on your outline. It's fundamental in theology, in this kind of theology, because it marks an essential difference between the activity of God and the activity of creatures. Created things operate as causes by modifying the properties of other things. And that's true, notice, even in the kinds of causal relations that we typically speak of as bringing something into existence, like, say, evolutionary processes bringing into existence a new species, or an artist creating a painting. That's still a matter of modifying the properties of existing things. It's also true of what we typically call causing something to cease to exist, say by bringing about destruction or death. So in those events, the configuration, the arrangement of matter, its form, is transformed. But God's creative act doesn't merely alter the properties of things, since apart from that divine action, there is no thing, nothing, to change. So this divine action radically transcends the causality exercised by creatures. It is the metaphysically prior act of establishing and sustaining the existence of creatures. Okay, so it's a transcendent form of causality. But for this very same reason, God's creative activity is radically immanent within the world. It is the immediate impartation of existence. And that is an action that is closer to creatures than they are to themselves. This is something Bill touched on this morning. So creation in this sense, again, a point that Bill made this morning, is an action unique to God alone. It's not something we can adequately describe or comprehend. As a shorthand, we may speak of God causing the existence of creatures, but the term cause is used analogically here, and we're unable to spell out precisely what it denotes in this case. It might be helpful to think of the concept of causing being as a metaphysical black box. The most we can do is to indicate the effect of this divine action, expressed as a counterfactual. If God did not do whatever it is that God does in causing the world to exist, there would be no world at all. Okay? That's about as far as you can go in explicating the concept of creation in this radical sense. Okay, so this concept of creation has a crucial bearing on this central question I want to ask about God's relation to natural causes. It follows from the view that God acts in every moment of the world's unfolding history. We cannot draw a line between events in which God acts and others in which God does not. Whatever occurs does so as a consequence of God's creative agency. Now, at this point, an ancient difficulty arises, and I want to explain this difficulty briefly because it's going to I'm going to use it as a kind of the hinge around which the rest of the discussion turns. It might be thought that this very strong concept of creation entails that God is the only agent, the only cause at work in the world, and that the apparent operation of causes in nature is just the occasion for God's immediate act of specifying each new state of the universe. That view came to be known as occasionalism. Okay? So in theology, we too have our arcane technical vocabulary. I would be remiss if I didn't lay claim to at least some obscure terms for our side in this conversation. Those who defend occasionalism typically contend that since God's creative act grounds the existence of every entity, along with all its properties, God alone is causally efficacious. Let me give you an example. Imagine a mundane, but for some of us very important act of making a cup of tea. Okay? Given the doctrine of creation out of nothing, we might think, mistakenly I will argue, that we should analyze this event in roughly the following way. At each moment, God causes the flame, the teapot, and the water to exist and to possess each of their properties. Over a series of contiguous times, God successively instantiates these entities with a set of properties that vary in relation to each other. So you might imagine a series of momentary actualities that add up to the entities familiar to us in our experience, the teapot and the water and so on. The teapot and the water become warm. The proportion of water and water vapor changes. The vapor pressure increases. A teapot whistle occurs. You notice where I put that? I didn't say the teapot begins to whistle, because the teapot doesn't actually do that. It's God whistling. Important theological idea. And so on. Okay? So you get the basic idea of the occasionalist view. Everything that happens here is done directly by God, and the causal roles played by created things are merely apparent, not actual. If God is consistent over time in the ways that God acts, then we can formulate laws that describe our world. But these laws simply identify patterns of constant conjunction in God's creative activity from moment to moment. So we have then the pleasing irony of a theologically motivated Humean view of causality. It's ironic because of Hume's deep resistance to theism generally, Christianity in particular. So this is not a purely fanciful metaphysical view. It's had a long history, particularly in Islam. Al-Ash'ari in the 10th century held roughly the view I just described, sort of parenthetically, of instantaneous creation, sort of adding up little time slices of things, accumulating over time to be what appear to be enduring objects. It can be found in Malebranche, too, in response to Cartesian dualism, trying to understand about how minds and bodies get coordinated. But Christian theologians have resisted this view. They have not wanted to conclude that their doctrine of creation entails that created things do not operate as causes in their own right. So Thomas Aquinas, with Muslim occasionalists in mind, said the following thing, quote, "There are some who have taken God's working in everything that acts to mean that no created power affects anything in the world, but that God alone does everything without intermediaries. For example, it would not be the fire giving heat, but God in the fire, and similarly in all other instances," end of quote. So he argues against this view and insists that, quoting again, "God's action in creatures must be understood in such a way that they themselves still exercise their own operations," end quote. So it's certainly within God's power to act as the occasionalists suggest. God could make the water boil quite without using the heat of the flame as a means. But Aquinas contends that God's generosity in creation includes granting causal powers to created things, so that in their actions they affect and are affected by each other. Now that introduces the familiar scheme of primary and secondary causation. Again, Bill referred to this morning. And it marks a distinction between what God does directly and what God does indirectly by means of or through the activity of created things. It's helpful to link that distinction to the earlier metaphysical distinction I made. Creatures, I said, operate as causes solely by inducing changes in other things. God, on the other hand, acts more radically to cause the very existence of creatures. That is the primary creative act. Okay? And it is always direct. But God can also cause change. And God may do that either directly or indirectly. If God causes the pot of water to heat up spontaneously, then God acts directly to bring about a change in the properties of an object. In that particular instance, the effect of God's direct action would depart from the ordinary course of nature, where water is heated by a heat source. And so it would be a Humean miracle, right? It would be a departure from the ordinary course of nature. But ordinarily, Aquinas and the tradition of claim, God brings about particular changes in the world indirectly, acting through creatures as causal intermediaries. So God heats the water by means of the flame. So by establishing and sustaining an order of natural causes, God produces the unfolding series of events that constitutes the history of the world. To the extent that specific developments in that history follow from the causal structures and initial conditions that God has put in place, they can be attributed to God as indirect divine acts. For example, the emergence of rational moral agents, and perhaps, depending upon how we tell the story, the existence of each of us here and now, can properly be described as an intentional action of God. That conclusion is not in the least undercut if we acknowledge that God's intentional action was carried out through a staggeringly vast series of natural causes developing over billions of years, rather than through a specific divine intervention in biological processes. So just a little dig at intelligent design theory. We don't need to insist on the incompleteness of biological explanation or other scientific explanations in order to affirm that God's purposes are at work in the history of life. Okay? The whole fantastic history, cosmological evolution that we've been hearing about can all be understood as an indirect act of God in which each of the effects, under certain conditions, can be understood as particular divine actions. So that's a very powerful conceptual structure for understanding God's action in and through the natural order, and it continues to be widely invoked in theology. But I want to consider, what time I have left, what becomes of this conceptuality when we bring it into contact with the new ways of thinking about nature that emerge in contemporary physics, and in particular on quantum mechanics. This Thomistic scheme of primary and secondary causation relies upon an account of causality that's tied to an ontology of substances and their properties. Most simply, substances are the bearers of properties, and properties are born by substances. Properties are either essential or accidental to a substance. Essential properties are those without which a substance would cease to be the kind of thing it is, and each kind is marked out by a common set of essential properties. Among these essential properties are active and passive causal powers. That is, the capacity to bring about changes in other substances and to be changed by them. So causal powers are a function of the ordered network of properties that a substance possesses as an instance of its kind. Using a modern example, we could say carbon dioxide traps heat in the atmosphere because its molecular structure, right, it's carbon into oxygen, right, that can vibrate at certain frequencies, because it absorbs and re-emits electromagnetic radiation in the infrared. Okay? So causal relations and causal laws, then, are rooted in intrinsic properties of the things that God creates. And though Aquinas wouldn't put it quite this way, these causal powers license a set of counterfactual generalizations, what would happen under counterfactual conditions. Laws of nature, in turn, are descriptive and derived from the capacities of things. They are prescriptive only insofar as they articulate the logos of creation as conceived in the mind of God. So that's the very simple outline of the substance ontology within which one could talk about causal powers. The quantum realm notoriously can't be represented in these terms. That will be the fundamental problem we want to grapple with here. And there's no agreement, as far as I can see, as an interested layman looking in from the outside, listening into these discussions among physicists, there's no agreement on what account we should give of the fundamental structures in the world that give rise to the behavior described by the quantum formalism. So that's the first point I want to make about quantum mechanics. Namely, it can be interpreted in a striking variety of different ways, and there is no unproblematic path from quantum physics to metaphysics. That interpretive pluralism in struggling to make sense of quantum mechanics, it's due at least in part to the irreducibly statistical character of the quantum formalism. As you all know, according to the uncertainty principle, it's not possible to specify with complete precision all the properties of a quantum system. So, for example, electrons have various determinate properties: mass, charge, spin, magnitude. But we cannot simultaneously know the electron's position and momentum or its spin orientation on more than one axis. And before a measurement is made, the best we can do in characterizing its state is to specify an evolving set of probabilities for the value that would be obtained for the property we choose to measure. The quantum mechanical description of the system maps a structure of well-defined potentialities that undergoes a smooth development over time according to the Schrödinger equation. So although some properties of the system are indeterminate before measurement, the probabilistic state of the system evolves in strict conformity to a deterministic equation. But when the right sort of interaction takes place, a specific value is obtained for the measured property. When we run that electron through the Stern-Gerlach device you were talking about, through a magnetic field, we determine its spin orientation. We get one value, not a distribution. Right? It's at this point, in the transition from a superposition of possibilities to a determinate outcome, that the causal story told by quantum mechanics is incomplete. Okay? The quantum formalism doesn't provide causally sufficient conditions for the selection of one of the probabilistically structured potentials rather than another. Now, physicists and philosophers have generated a dizzying array of suggestions about what this mathematical machinery reveals to us about the world, if anything. Discussion of that question has been marked by sharp disagreement from the very earliest days in the extended debate, say, between Bohr and Einstein about the completeness or incompleteness of quantum mechanics. It's important to keep in mind that not only indeterministic but also deterministic interpretations can be given of quantum mechanics. Though Bell's theorem and EPR-type experiments of the kind we were hearing about this morning make it clear as I understand them, that we can't reproduce classical local determinism at this level of nature. So a good example is David Bohm's very ingenious reconstruction of quantum theory, which gives particles a complete set of determinate properties, with position being basic, but introduces weirdness, introduces guidance equations, pilot waves, that maintain instantaneous correlations at space-like distances. Okay? So we're a long way from anything like classical local determinism. So if we want to do what I'm trying to do here and think about the implications of these ideas in physics for theology, okay, we can't avoid working with one or another of the available interpretive approaches. Since each of the interpretive approaches is going to have somewhat different implications for how we think about God's relation to quantum processes. So I want to reflect a little bit here on indeterministic interpretations. They seem to predominate in the current discussion. There are multiple candidates here, several flavors of Copenhagen interpretation, and in response to, in part, to the measurement problem, there are a whole bunch of more recent approaches. Decoherence, GRW, spontaneous collapse theories, a variety of theories are being offered. These views, they differ significantly from each other, but for my purposes, it's enough to know what they share. They accept the completeness of quantum mechanics, and so deny that every property of quantum systems has a determinate value at every moment. And they accept the underdetermination of the transition from the superposition state to a measured outcome. So those two features of quantum mechanics, along with their non-local character, disrupts the theological scheme of divine action through secondary causes. Right? So that's the problem I want to pursue. First, on indeterminateness. If we suppose that there are no hidden variables that would allow us to specify a value for each property of a quantum system at every moment of its evolution, then uncertainty about these values is not merely epistemic, but is rooted somehow in the quantum entity itself. An electron just is this odd mix of determinate and indeterminate properties. It's a determinate point mass charge. With a superposition of incompatible spin orientations distributed probabilistically across a region of space. I mean, that's a very strange sort of thing. Right? It's hard to turn it into an intelligible object. It hardly needs to be said. It's not the kind of entity envisioned by classical theory of secondary causation. So it looks like the metaphysics of substances with essential properties that support causal powers needs to be fundamentally revised if it can be sustained at all. There's a philosopher of science and philosopher of religion, a guy named Bruce Gordon, who offers a sophisticated version of an argument of this kind against naturalism, what he calls naturalism generally. By naturalism, he means that the view that the sum, quoting him, the sum and substance of everything that exists is exhausted by physical objects and processes and whatever is causally dependent upon them. I don't want to reproduce his full argument here. My main interest is in his contention that necessitarian theories of causal law, like the causal powers view and counterfactual views, break down at the quantum level. So let me just sketch the key point, the key way he sets this up. A necessary condition for being a physical object is that the entity must have one or more determinate properties that allow it to be uniquely identified or individuated, to be picked out. The standard way this is done is through spatio-temporal location. But if quantum mechanics is complete, then the fundamental constituents of physical reality don't meet this condition for physical or material objecthood. Their intrinsic properties, like mass and charge and spin of the electron, are identical with all other properties of the same type, and therefore don't identify a unique individual. Their quantum state-dependent properties, like position, momentum, spin orientation, are indeterminate, and therefore also fail to uniquely identify a single individual. But the causal powers view requires that the bearers of these powers have well-defined properties that are connected in lawful ways. It's these properties that give rise to the nomological regularities in the interaction of objects. So because the relevant properties of quantum entities do not have exact values prior to measurement, these conditions for the causal power views are not met. Quantum theory can't be understood as describing a structure of causal relationships. So that's the way Gordon argues. Now, we might try to reply to that argument in this way. We might want to say, well, look, what we need to do is incorporate the stochastic properties of quantum entities into a revised theory of causal powers, rather than requiring determinate properties linked by necessitating relationships that can be expressed in single outcome counterfactuals. This view would give a central role to non-necessitating probabilistic causality. The quantum entity would then be understood as an evolving structure of potentiality. Its essential nature is defined not only by its intrinsic determinate properties, but also by a set of well-defined probabilistic propensities. And its causal powers, in this case, arise from its capacity to generate with precise likelihoods just these outcome states. Okay? So maybe we can recover the idea of a quantum entity that's sufficiently well-defined. The causal role of the quantum entity could be spelled out then in a set of counterfactual conditionals that specify not what would happen, but rather what might happen, articulated stochastically. So that sounds good, but the flaw in that strategy, the flaw in this ointment, is that the revised story about causality once again runs up against the problem that quantum entities can't be adequately individuated as discrete bearers of these stochastic properties. The electrons in a helium atom are qualitatively identical, indistinguishable, and they must be described by a single wave function. But according to the Pauli exclusion principle, that wave function must be antisymmetric so that they can't have the same quantum number. Their joint state can't be represented as the sum of objective probabilities possessed by each electron considered by itself. Rather, they have to be described in relation to each other. And they become differentiated as distinct individuals only when one of their correlated probabilistic properties collapses to a determinate value. And that connection persists even when they are separated at space-like distances. So in EPR-type experiments, we make separate measurements on two particles. But the relationship between the particles can't be captured by the idea that they are localized bearers of causal powers, as I was just trying to do. Rather than being a transmission of causal influence between discrete individuals, these particles constitute a relational system. There's that term again, relational system. A whole that somehow maintains instantaneous correlations of its separated components. And there appears to be no intelligible causal analysis of this situation, and yet current physical theory suggests that it is ubiquitous in nature. So these considerations make it really tough to be a realist, even a chastened and critical realist, about quantum theory. They suggest that we might think of the theory simply as a useful construct that guides our actions and expectations. On a view of this sort, this more modest view of our ability to sort of probe quantum stuff, quantum mechanics would provide an elegant mapping of predictive regularities, but it does so without supplying an account of what gives rise to them. The theory would function as a probabilistic calculator, telling us what's likely to happen under specified conditions. But the object language of the theory, its talk about the various inhabitants of the particle zoo, can be empirically adequate, even if we give up on the claim that this language correctly describes and discloses real items in the world. That's the view of, as I understand it, of Bas van Fraassen, Princeton philosopher of science. This is not to deny, I want to hasten to add, that there is something we interact with in experimental physics. It's not a denial that there's a real external world. It's just to say that the theories we construct about this level of structure in nature may turn out not to tell a helpful story about what that something is. The language of particles and properties has its value as a description of the quantum stuff we encounter in the... Let me correct that. It has its value not as a description of the quantum stuff that we encounter in the laboratory, but as a vocabulary for identifying patterns, shaping inquiry, predicting results of new experiments, and so on. Okay, so maybe we should settle for that kind of metaphysically spare, very modest way of thinking about quantum reality. But if we were to embrace it, then we'd have to abandon the theory of causal powers. There is an alternative account of causality waiting in the wings, regularist accounts, which hold that causal statements and causal laws just identify recurring sequences in experience. So on this view, secondary causes with active powers disappear into patterns of observable events. The metaphysical modesty, as I say, is appealing, but I want to suggest here, before I finish up, is that if we import this regularist interpretation of causality into theology, we may find ourselves facing the second coming of occasionalism. Okay? That difficulty comes particularly into view when we think about the second, I'd mentioned two puzzles from quantum mechanics for primary cause, secondary cause views. The second of those puzzles has to do with indeterminacy, the underdetermination of quantum outcomes. The kinds of interpretations that we're considering that I've been talking about understand the transition from the superposition state to a measured outcome as causally discontinuous. So although the wave function evolves smoothly and deterministically over time, its collapse to a determinate value is not determined by anything in the prior history of the system. The outcome will have necessary but not sufficient conditions, antecedent conditions. So as a result, the causal structure of the universe, whatever it might turn out to be, is not going to be closed and complete. So it's going to be open and gappy. If that's the way the world is, then a really perplexing theological question arises that I don't think has been discussed enough. What is God's relation to these underdetermined quantum transitions? First point to make, of course, is that God acts as their creator, just as with every other individual and event in the history of the universe. The puzzle in this case, however, is to explain what God creates. So stop and think about that with me for a moment, okay? In presenting the idea of creation, I made a distinction between the divine action of giving being, which is always direct or immediate, and the act of causing change, which for God may be either direct or indirect. And the reply to occasionalism called upon that distinction to make the case that God may directly cause the existence of a creature along with all of its properties, without also directly causing it to acquire those properties. That can be left to other creatures operating as causes in their own right. Now, however, in this quantum context, we find ourselves considering a class of exceedingly odd entities, these bundles of evolving potentiality, that undergo transitions that do not have sufficient secondary causal conditions. In this context, can we any longer make a distinction between what God does directly in giving being and what God does indirectly in acting through creatures to cause change? It appears that the outcome state of a quantum transition must either be determined by God or by nothing at all. So let's think about those two options for just a moment. Second of those two options, determined by nothing at all, particularly intriguing and puzzling. It's roughly the idea that God leaves quantum transitions up to chance. God, in this case, would have the temerity to utterly defy Einstein and massively play dice with the universe. It's important here not to be misled by the familiar expression, leaving it up to chance, as though chance were an odd sort of cause. a process or mechanism that can be relied upon to produce an outcome. That's characteristic of the way chance works for us. Right? We roll the dice, we flip the coin, unable to predict the result because we can't calculate the outcome state that will follow from these initial conditions and the relevant causal laws. But that's just epistemic chance. Okay? And it reflects the limits of our cognitive powers. In this case, we're talking about what might be called ontological chance. And we can make use of that too. We can arrange structures in the world in such a way that we amplify quantum transitions to produce observable results. That happens in the physics lab all the time. It's what determines the fate of Schrodinger's unfortunate cat in the box. Right? But notice, neither of those ways of leaving it up to chance are available to God. That's the point I want to make. Okay? So how would the Creator leave some aspects of creation up to chance? The puzzle is that God would bring a creature into existence without specifying what the creature shall be. Okay? It makes no sense, I think, to say that God creates something that is nothing in particular. But perhaps we could think of God creating units of structured potentiality, or in light of non-locality, webs of interwoven potentialities, without specifying which of their future states is actualized. This is a weird way of creating, but maybe it makes sense. The created world would then spontaneously undergo transitions to new states, permitted by the stochastic structure of the potentialities God called into being. Philosopher of religion, metaphysician Peter Van Inwagen appears to propose something like this in an essay of his. He contends that in an indeterministic universe, some states of affairs might neither be determined by secondary causes nor by God. Indeed, he suggests that God could choose not to determine even the initial state of the universe. Perhaps God could issue a disjunctive creative decree, like let X or Y be, right? So the word by which God creates is a disjunction. Van Inwagen thinks that that's possible. It boggles my mind. I mean, suppose that the result of this divine decree is that X springs into existence. If God does not cause X to exist rather than Y, then what does? The persistence of that question reflects just how deeply our thinking is informed by the principle of sufficient reason. And the principle of sufficient reason powers what is, in my view, the best of the theistic arguments for God, the cosmological argument, which has been in the background of some of the discussion here. It would be a little disappointing to press the cosmological argument, to press its demand for explanation, all the way back to a self-existent creator, only to discover that the creator doesn't, after all, provide any reason for the existence of this universe, for X rather than for Y. Okay? So we cannot establish the principle of sufficient reason as a kind of logical truth. Nonetheless, we seem to be deeply committed to it. What's the alternative? The alternative is to say, as a first approximation, that God specifies the outcome of naturally underdetermined transitions in quantum systems. This has the advantage of preserving the principle of sufficient reason. Right? Now every change has an explanation, either in secondary causes or in God. But this mode of divine action goes beyond sustaining the existence of creatures, on the one hand, and acting indirectly through them to produce their various effects on the other. Here, God acts directly to cause particular changes in the world, bringing about events that would not, or properly really might not, have occurred had God not so acted. Right? Let me just note in passing that provides an interesting possibility in theology, that God might profoundly shape the course of the world's history without in any way disrupting whatever causal structures are in place. It would constitute a form of non-miraculous, particular divine action in the world. Right? It also, however, entails that God is massively and pervasively engaged in the production of events in the world, determining states of affairs that nature leaves determinable. And that leads to a number of theological worries, including questions about determinism, questions about moral freedom, the problem of evil, but you'll be relieved to know there is no time for me to address any of those questions here. I just want to make a quick concluding remark about occasionalism and how it might follow from that view. Does this view of God's action in underdetermined events lead us right back to occasionalism, which you'll remember is the view that God is the only cause, the only efficient cause? Okay? In order to see why one might think so, let me just briefly pull together the threads of the discussion so far, give you a little summary that leads to this conclusion. Quantum mechanics, we've said, requires that we fundamentally rethink traditional accounts of secondary causes as substances with determinate properties that ground causal powers. Quantum non-locality in particular can't be understood in terms of classical causal concepts and leaves us with stochastically lawful but unexplained correlations. Suppose that in the face of this, we adopt a regularist interpretation of these causal laws that I was talking about earlier, this modest, very modest metaphysics of causation. In that case, the object language of quantum theory is understood as a conceptual device that articulates, that speaks, harking back to speakable and unspeakable, right? That speaks the mathematics of the quantum formulas, allowing us to make predictions, directing ongoing research, and so on. But we cannot now say that God produces these effects, the observed effects, by means of the operation of quantum entities as secondary causes, because we no longer have an intelligible concept of the bearer of such causal roles and powers. Okay? But if, on the other hand, we respond to underdetermination of quantum transitions by asserting that God directly brings about each of these events, then each of them is an immediate expression of God's creative activity. And so is the world of macroscopic objects, properties, and relations that is built upon this base. Now, that certainly sounds like the triumphant return of occasionalism. Okay? Because on this account, our familiar world consists of a vast aggregation of instantaneous divine acts that give being to each event and fix its content. Natural laws simply identify patterns in this divine action, and God is the only efficient cause. The world appears to contain finite objects bearing intrinsic causal powers, but this is merely an appearance. As Aquinas recognized, in an occasionalist world, creatures do not in fact operate as causes, and therefore lack, we might say, a structure of active being, an act of existing that is their own. That's the deepest criticism, it seems to me, or the deepest reason for theological discontent with occasionalism. The occasionalist God does not, after all, create a world of creatures that are other than God and God's own immediate activity. So, I've tried to set up a problem. Right? I do not know the way out of this difficulty. We've got this sort of decision tree of puzzles, right? And you answer one way and you get into one kind of trouble. You answer it another, you get into another kind of trouble. This entertains people like me. It may not. It may simply try your patience. But there are, I think, a variety of ways of working one's way through this. Let me suggest two strategies. One would be to come up with a revised causal powers view at the quantum level. Perhaps something along the lines I suggested briefly above in speculating about structures or networks of creative potentiality. The second strategy would be to argue that secondary causation is an emergent phenomenon, maybe along the lines that Michael Heller suggested yesterday, that is, the non-local, holistic relations at the lowest level give rise to local causal relations. It's a top-down view at the bottom, or as Michael put it, a top-up view. Okay? But I just want to note that if we develop that sort of view against an occasionalist background, against the background of this metaphysical problem that I've been talking about, it involves a unique kind of emergence. In this case, we would not be saying that secondary causal processes at a lower level in nature provide the base for new kinds of causal processes and relationships at higher levels. The sort of thing that George has described so eloquently. Rather, we are imagining that direct divine action without created causes at the quantum level would provide the base for the emergence of secondary causes, genuine creaturely causes, at higher levels. That is, there would be no entities with causal powers underlying quantum phenomena. Just God's activity did. But God's activity at this level would give rise to such entities at higher levels. It would involve a transition from occasionalism at the micro level to the emergence of intrinsic causal powers at higher levels. Okay, and that's a special case of emergence. It's an intriguing idea. I don't know whether it could be developed successfully or not. So I said at the outset I was going to try to ask some questions that I can't really answer, and I think it's safe to say I probably succeeded in that, if nothing else. But here's the bottom line conclusion. If we theologians want to keep using the primary-secondary causation scheme, which has proved so useful, so powerful, so important in the past, we ought to recognize and grapple with the fact that its metaphysical foundations have been undermined, and it's not clear how to provide a new basis for a comparable way of relating divine and created agencies. But we can take some comfort in the knowledge that theology is not alone in finding that old ways of thinking about causality have come unstuck in the encounter with quantum mechanics. It's a massive problem for metaphysicians of all sorts, and there's a big philosophical discussion of these issues taking place. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Do we have some questions before the break for our speaker? Bill?
Surface some real puzzles. I think that you've done you've really challenged us, but also clarified a number of issues. This is on, okay. One aspect of this puzzle that I've thought a little bit about is that when we talk about the underdetermination of a quantum event or a quantum observation, it's precisely that. It's an underdetermination. It's not a complete non-determination, right? And so what that means, as I understand it, is that there are some classically relevant properties. For instance, the exact position or the exact time of an event, or the exact momentum of the particle that we detect, that are not determined. I mean, not precisely determined, and that there's a statistical probability of a range of values, right? But the thing is that doesn't mean that the event itself is completely undetermined. It means that there are some aspects of it that are undetermined. So in this sense, what you'd be asking for from the point of view of God's action, if you were to say that God, in some sense, complemented the determination, you'd be asking God just to determine those properties of the event which are not determined. Now, just my last point would be the following, that I've often thought that maybe the problem really is that the fact that that in the quantum world, not in the classical world, in the quantum world, those properties in some sense don't really exist to begin with. I mean, in the quantum world, there's no such thing as a precise energy or a precise time or a precise position, right? Or a precise direction of spin. So in the quantum world, if we were actually living in the quantum world, those things wouldn't make any sense. And so my particular thought would be is that perhaps what's actually happening is that as we in the classical world encounter the quantum world, the quantum world in classical terms has to have such a position, but there's no such position in the quantum world. And so in some sense, the projection into the classical world can take a variety of different versions, but that doesn't mean it's undetermined. I mean, it's undetermined from our point of view, but it's not undetermined from the point of view of the quantum world. You see what I mean?
Yeah, I'm not sure how you get the determination of the quantum from sort of the quantum world's point of view, how that reemerges somehow through its interaction with us, as it were, at the macroscopic level.
It's just that, well, I mean, I don't know that this is the answer, but I mean, it's just that the projection, you're projecting something in the quantum world which does not have an exact position or exact some of these properties that we think should be exact from a classical point of view. That you're projecting that into the classical world.
So then collapse is just an appearance at the classical level.
Right, it's an appearance
of a structure that remains.
Right.
That at the quantum level can't at any point be described as having all of its properties specified.
Right. I don't know. I mean, that's only a suggestion.
Yeah, let's talk more about that and see if we can figure out how that helps resolve some of these dilemmas. It's to offer a deterministic interpretation of quantum mechanics, right? So you've got indeterminacy, that is the probabilistic character of the quantum state for certain of the properties, right? And you got a transition there to an observed value, but it sounds like you're proposing that you don't have a collapse, except.
Well, from the classical point of view, you do have a collapse.
Yeah, but that's strictly from the classical point of view.
Yeah.
And so.
I don't know. I mean, I'm just toying with that idea.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I don't have the physics probably to appropriate it as it deserves to be made use of.
Thank you. Do we have more comments or questions? So if not, we can thank our speaker and break for a coffee. Thank you very much.